that we can talk about. This is my opinion, and this is also backed up by a number of researchers in Europe, surprisingly or not, that go for a contextualizing of the traumatic events in the case of post-colonial literatures. It wasn't that context-focused in the beginning when I referred to trauma studies, because everything started when it comes to this with the father of all pains, namely Sigmund Freud. He established basically what can be defined as psychological trauma. Unfortunately, he focused very much on the effects of it. So whenever he speaks about anything painful, he would refer to the long or short-term effects of the traumatic incidents. Therefore, in the case of Sigmund Freud, the main key concepts that he's working with are belatedness, the belatedness of the traumatic acts, melancholia, or the incapacity to narrate or to speak out the traumatic event. Now, the immediate consequence of that is that there is a postponement or an intention to obliterate what is painful, not to talk about it. This was served very well by what happened in the literary theory a little bit later, namely in what is called deconstructivism in the 70s and 80s, in the 60s and 70s, sorry, in which the relation between reality, language, and representation played a key role. Now, according to deconstructivism, and we do know that, there is always an implosion of meaning. There is a free play of signifiers. There is always a decontextualization of reality. Well, basically, I don't know if there is any reality of any sort. Also connected with deconstructivism, we associate the incapacity to represent things. Now, Sigmund Freud's theory combined with this literary or theoretical literary approach, deconstructivism, were very useful for a number of American researchers who started the field of trauma studies, and their names are Dori Lau, Shoshana Feldman, Kathy Caruth, who declared that any traumatic event cannot be represented. All personal or collective traumatic events are beyond representation. We cannot bring them to the conscious level and formulate judgments on them, and we also cannot approach any way of healing what happened previously. Their theory is based on a particular historical event, namely the Holocaust. But from this, they extended or they took out some general remarks that would definitely favor that particular historical event and generalized them and tried to apply them to a worldwide reception of any historical-based traumatic incident. And this is working very nicely in the American academia. Anytime they are talking about trauma studies, they practically take out this theoretical framework established by the persons I mentioned, and they explain, as in the case of post-colonial Western theories, what is happening with the traumatized persons, with the traumatized individuals, in spite of their historical belonging. It is, as Jeffrey Hartman, another scholar in the field of trauma studies, what can lead to the collapse of the understanding So once you settle a general attitude, you will blindly follow it, and you will not be able to understand what happens at a local level. Now, this obviously leads to what is called indeterminacy. And by indeterminacy, I refer to that attitude in which I cannot define a particular incident in a particular way. I can apply the same pattern to 1 or 2 or number 3 equally. There is no way in which I can represent, according to these theories, what would make me understand and take action against what constituted a traumatic event. Opposed to this attitude, which is very general and universal, there is what is called a therapeutic approach, and this is defined by a psychologist, Judith Herman, which refers to or suggests the integration of the traumatic event at the level of consciousness. And you will see why this is relevant in the case of post-colonial studies. She promotes, or she is the adept of the sufferer's healing and recovery. So it is not just the fact that we have to mention that a traumatic event happened that affected me individually or collectively, but I have to find ways in which I can explain what happened. And by finding these ways, I can then heal and take actions against any future potential traumatic events. In this context, she suggests that literature can be the best way to do this. By the fact that she admits that traumatic events can be represented, there is an open dimension to making things narrative. So she suggests adopting this attitude towards surpassing what cannot be said. She suggests that we should go beyond just making a taboo of a traumatic event, and by narrating it, we can share the individual or collective experience with the other nations, with the other literatures. She comes from the field of psychology, and trauma studies as such is not just about literature. It is in fact a combination between literature, literary theory, psychology, cultural studies. Therefore, she opens the door for potential novelists, poets, drama writers to go in this line, and in this way to make way to a different approach than the atemporal one. She's not the first to do that. In the field of literary studies, we also have Dominique Lacapra, who goes for the same attitude, and who says that once you bring together different traumatic experiences, they will lead to a conflation of historical specificity. And this will mislead you into considering one event typical for a person or for a nation as such. Another scholar, Linda Ballau, she underlines that it is only through language and through the capacity of the language to represent that we can indeed postulate, formulate, and heal what cannot be uttered and what is considered as irrepresentable by the American school. Now, a second thesis defended by the American school in trauma studies is that the traumatic experience may establish solidarity and communion links among cultures beyond the cultural specificities. Now, she says that in her book, Unclaimed Experience, she manages a new perspective on history, which is perceived no longer as straightforwardly referential, but as indirectly referential, based on Freud's political disengagement. she says, or she proclaims, that if we identify the same patterns of behavior in different cultures, then this is a way to understand each other. My opinion related to that is that it won't work, because if you are coming with a particular framework which is defined in your own culture, you cannot understand what is happening in another culture. It's a way in which we don't bring, as it is the common clash, the West and the East together, but I think this proclaiming of the fact that we can indeed find similarities may lead only to deepening the gap between nations. So I may be in a power position, and I may deliver you a set of ideological themes and say, if you follow that, of course I will know you better. So this is the tendency that she's trying to promote. Everything comes down to power, and everything comes down to ideology. Even if this kind of discourse, atemporal and representable, may sound very theoretical, in my opinion, I think that it is very ideologized. It is a tendency, it is an ideology to promote your own approach to things, disregard the others, and try to proclaim freedom of speech or a freedom of understanding the other as well. So her attitude is quite criticized by other scholars who accuse her of annihilating any historical or temporal specificity. Surprisingly or not, as I said in the beginning, there is an European tendency of disregarding the American approach in this field. So usually when you say Europe, you'd say it's an area prejudiced against what can be historically specific. But there is this new trend, which is called the ethical attitude to trauma studies, and which is developed by scholars like Steph Klaus and Gerd Gwillens. And they accuse Keith Ruth and Dori Lau and Shoshana Feldman of having an exclusively Western attitude. They accuse the American scholars of trying to apply Western frameworks to what cannot be applied to, namely to a reality that has nothing to do economically, ideologically, politically with the background on which this kind of theory functions. They accuse the American perspective, the American attitude, as being mono-perspectivist, ignoring everything that is non-aerial, that is not in their space. Consequence of that is that this attitude may lead to huge misunderstandings and to huge misinterpretations in the context of the particular post-colonial nations. A third concept that I think is quite necessary to be dealt with in this approach is the concept of transmissibility. Again, the American school goes and says, we cannot write, we cannot produce literature about some traumatic events to which we haven't been witnesses. There is no possibility that we can define, that we can truly render something that happened to someone else. Therefore, it is better either to gather some information or to keep silent. And that relates automatically with what I've said that these theories are based on, and namely the Holocaust experience. So, according to this attitude, Shoshana Feldman and Dori Loeb established the difference between witness and listener. The risk being that the former, the witness, is always a passive, inarticulate victim. His testimony lacking any political involvement. So once you witness something, you do have a passive attitude, and you cannot proclaim your attitude to that, or if you have any idea. While in the second case, being a listener, you usually relate emotionally, in an empathic way. So again, you cannot respond politically or ideologically to something. According to these researchers, this is the only kind of representation of trauma we are entitled to. So a victim cannot write, a listener or a witness cannot get themselves into an active position. Therefore, what may come out of this is just a decontextualized, again, a decontextualized product that is to be transmitted and promoted in the world as being representative for, again, and I focus on this, on a particular culture. Alan Young insists that this representation of psychological trauma is universal and transhistorical. Therefore, it should be opposed by trauma, or the reception of trauma, from an ideological, social, and political perspective. He says something like this: the disorder that happens to people and to nations is not timeless, nor does it possess an intrinsic unity. Rather, it is glued together by the practices, technologies, and narratives with which it is studied, treated, and represented, and by the various interests, institutions, and moral arguments that mobilize these efforts and resources. So, practically, he says that what we have to do, even if we are talking about such a psychological subject, we have to put it in context. We have to take, and this is not just the case of post-colonial studies, but of any studies that refer to traumatic experiences, we have to place everything into a particular context. We have to think about the social and political conditions that generated that. And more important than that, I think we should consider the ideological outcome of it. I go back to my saying, it is all a matter of power. If we go for an ahistorical approach, we will serve a particular attitude. You may say that if we follow a contextualized approach, we may run into the same risk. But we have to balance the effects of that, or what we can gain out of each situation. So, there is another problem, again theoretical, related to this and with an impact on post-colonial studies, namely the treatment of individual or collective psychology, or individual and collective trauma situations. Now, if the focus on personal trauma may imply ignoring the social-cultural conditions that made the traumatic abuse possible, with obvious depoliticizing consequences, the focus on collective trauma justifies considering sufferance from the perspective of an ideological and political construct. This is what Alan Young says in The Harm and Evolutions, Inventing Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder. Yes and no. If I say individual trauma, that doesn't necessarily take me out of time, because I am part of a society. So I think that in the case of post-colonial literature, it's not just that we should focus on the collective, but also on the individual. Now, the risk that may run from an individual-based approach is that you may get very, very local and very specific. And you may construct just some very small islands or small maps of trauma. But all these brought together, they define the collective traumatic suffering in all nations that suffered in a way or another. I think that this introduction, in a way or another, to this field of studies, trauma studies, is very important when dealing with post-colonial literature. Maybe I'm wrong in doing this because I refer to post-colonial literature, and this is a South Asian seminar, or South Asian focused seminar. But I'm just trying to settle out some very abstract things that would work, I think, perfectly in the case of South Asian studies by focusing on the necessity of defining